Hello and welcome to the Political Orphanage, a home for plucky misfits and problem solvers. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, wishing you a very happy Valentine's Day this week. To that end, on today's show, we will be talking about sex, the economics of marriage, which is slightly less entertaining, and we will also wander into some very dangerous what is gender territory. Some amount of sex, though. In fact, I reveal more about my own sordid sex life than I probably should have, but it's too late to redo it. We're at this point of the production cycle, so here we go. Oh, and parents, there's more math than genitals in today's episode. But there are still some genitals, so keep that in mind if you have kids in the car, because it's sex by the numbers right here on The Political Orphanage.
My guest today is Cathy Reisenwitz. She is my favorite feminist writer and the writer for Sex and the State on Substack. That is a newsletter that I regularly read. I am a subscriber of it, and I particularly enjoy it, not just because Cathy has a different viewpoint than me, but I think that she oftentimes has new ways of looking at things. So it's not so much that I enjoy encountering challenging ideas, but a lot of the time, Cathy just makes me think about things differently. And I really enjoy that, and I'm delighted to have you on the show, Cathy.
I'm so happy to be here, Andrew. Thank you.
We're going to talk about sex, maybe economics, probably marriage, probably gender. And I'll kick it off with sex. One of the things I was astonished to learn this week in preparation to our talk, Cathy, is apparently hookup culture is a myth. I did not think that. I thought hookup culture was what everybody but me is engaging in. And turns out I am doing much better than I thought if the goal is sexual promiscuity. So what do people think hookup culture is, and what does the actual data say?
Yeah, I think people think that everyone is having sex with so many people, and that's normal. And as it turns out, there's actually a group of people, probably about 10% of the population, that researchers call high in sociosexuality. And this just kind of means they have a lot of partners. And the average person has between like 3 to 5 to 7 partners in their entire lives. So
wait, 3 to 5 to so 3 to 7 partners, is that right? In their whole lives?
Yeah, depending on the survey and how you're counting, but yeah, between 3 and 7.
Okay, I am doing so much better or worse, depending on your morality, than I thought I was. Because from my perspective, it's long periods of drought followed by very interesting periods. And from where I'm looking, I'm like, I don't know, I watch these sitcoms and they're all falling from hot bunk to hot bunk. And I assume that sitcoms are all vetted by the federal government for accuracy. And so I must be not pulling tail as much as the average bloke. But my body count, Cathy, is a little bit over 7. So it would appear that I'm in that sexually industrious category that you allude to.
You and I are mega sluts, as it turns out. Yeah.
I am a mega slut. That is true. But I like to think of it like sexually industrious. Like I'm just very productive below the waist. And also, I think I can say I'm a pretty good networker. I'm good at connecting people. And it turns out physically too.
I'm proud of you. I think that's great.
Thanks, Kat. The whole point of this was to let you know I'm apparently in that top 10%. So, okay, this in and of itself is kind of mind-blowing to me just because it doesn't feel right. I feel like most of the conversations I have with guys are, when it comes to sex and hookup culture, there's a presumption that it's happening and they've been left out. And there's a certain feeling of resentment that that everybody is hooking up. Like the married guys I know tend to think that were it not for being married, they would be killing it with online dating. And the guys that aren't married feel that something bad has befallen them that is precluding them from participating in a more sexually adventurous lifestyle. It sounds like not having a lot of sexual partners is actually very normal median bell curve distribution, and that if this category, you shouldn't feel like you're a loser.
Oh, 1,000%. Yeah, it's way more normal to have way fewer than 10 than to have more than 10 sexual partners in your entire life. And actually, married men have a lot more sex than single men on average. And rates of sexlessness are going up, not going down. So this idea that American society, everyone's getting sluttier is just not true. In fact, there's some data that indicates that boomers were sluttier than Gen Xers or millennials. And I think it's just like people who have a lot of sex are loud about it, much more so than people who aren't having a lot of sex. Not a lot of people come to brunch and are like, oh my God, you will not believe what I didn't do last night.
Yeah.
People are very loud about being slutty online, similarly. And I think there's a lot of pressure among men to perform masculinity by either having or saying you want to have a lot of sex or a lot of partners in a way that maybe isn't like, certainly isn't borne out in the data and may not be fully true for every man.
You mentioned that the rate of sex is going down, and I've heard, so immediately as a male, when you graduate college, there's this immediate feeling of like, that's over. And like all of the people in college are having fun, fascinating sex positions we didn't even know existed back in our day, and that we've been utterly left behind. But I've seen multiple reports on that there's both a fertility decline and there appears to be a fecundity decline that is accompanying that, where people are just having less sex. The data bears that out?
Yeah, the data that I've seen bears it out that there are more people who aren't having sex. Of the people who are having sex, they're having it less often. And so there's this idea that with sexual permissivity, so there's less stigma around queer sex and sex outside of marriage and these kinds of things, that you're necessarily going to have more sex, that a society that's more permissive is necessarily more sexually active or hornier or more promiscuous. And that's not true at all, as it turns out. So the two are possibly just unrelated in terms of how much sex a society has and how permissive it is around sexual norms. But what you do see is where the societies that are more permissive around sex, they don't necessarily become more sexually active or more, their sexual practices don't necessarily change in the way you would expect, but their rates of violence are lower. So there's less sexual violence against women where sex is less stigmatized.
I would not have predicted any of that. That's fascinating. So
it is.
The correlations are societies that become less sexually restrictive actually wind up having less sex, but they also have less sexual violence.
I can't say that they always or generally even end up having less sex. I will say countries in the loneliness epidemic, which it's all kind of related. There's less sex, less dating, less hanging out with friends, less drinking among adolescents. Like there's a whole slew of things that are happening. So I would probably say that, but I haven't seen the data necessarily to connect sexual permissivity with declines of sexual activity. But the data is very strong that sexual permissivity, so accepting queer people, accepting women having bodily autonomy, not slut shaming, not having a lot of stigma around porn, is very strongly associated with lower rates of violence against women, including sexual violence. Yes.
Okay. I can, now that I'm thinking about it, I can see the decline in sex occurring in a sexually permissive society, even outside of gay, queer, feminist circles, just in terms of like being pro-sex. Like, again, I apparently being incredibly sexually industrious, which is great news to me. I didn't know this. If you were to compare my very hot and cold sex life to that of my married peers, I have variety, which is interspersed by long periods of drought. Whereas my married male friends do not have the same variety. They don't have the same options available to them, presuming that they're not going to commit adultery, but they do have a partner that they're going to regularly have sex with. And so like, I could see that, like you're getting more opportunity, variety for sexual partners, but unless you're some incredibly elite square-jawed man that can just, do you want to go back to my house with no emotional connection whatsoever and have sex? Unless you're one of those dudes, you're probably going to have prolonged periods of less sexually active lifestyle.
Absolutely. That's what the data shows. And what really struck me is I grew up evangelical, and what I was told is without laws and the Bible and stigma against it, everybody would be having sex with everybody in every configuration, and that everybody wanted that. And I did, as it turns out, and I've had it and it's been great. But as it turns out, I am a very unusual person in that, like I said, about 10% of the population is like me, and 90% of humans don't really want to have a ton of partners and don't really want to have a ton of weird sex. And they're really just happy to have 1 to 3 to 5 people and to lock it down, and they're good with that. And so we don't really need these stigmas and laws and to shame people. If we just let people do what they want, 90% of them are going to do exactly what you want them to do. And the 10%, we're loud and annoying, but otherwise we're not really hurting anybody.
Yeah, I think I'm fine. I'm apparently a really horny Dick Van Dyke. Is anybody truly worried about horny Dick Van Dyke? That's basically me. So like, I don't think you need to curb me with laws or anything like that. I can think of one other reason that you might see declines in sexual activity. So the Pareto principle tends to hold pretty much every human distribution pattern. For anybody unfamiliar with the Pareto principle or Pareto, I don't know how I'm from Oklahoma. I say Pareto. It's an 80-20 distribution pattern. You see this everywhere. So in shoe sales, 20% of the customers purchase 80% of the shoes. And the reverse is true. 80% of the customers only buy 20% of the shoes. And that seems to be the case with like online dating, for example. So while I think I'm a catch, I can tell you confidently I'm not in the top 20% of online dating profiles in terms of the activity that I'm getting. So it could be a situation where the more promiscuous a society gets, the most appealing men have way more sex, and the bottom 80% of men, which apparently I'm in, get way less sex. Is that possible?
I think it just really underestimates how little sex everyone is having. So that 10% of the population...
I'm assuming everybody's horny Dick Van Dyke, like me.
Exactly.
But they're maybe not as horny as me. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So like most women, I think there's this idea that this Giga Chad, is having sex with all of these women. And most women are having like 3, again, to 5 to 7 partners in their entire lives. Most women aren't hooking up with anyone. Most men aren't hooking up with anyone because most people don't hook up. They get into monogamous relationships until they find their life partner. So my experience is people who are in that slutty 10% mostly just find and have sex with each other. Most of the people that I've had sex with, I'm not pulling out of monogamy land. They're in the dating world with me. And in the Bay Area, for example, like we have our own like clubs and, organizations and parties where we just hang out with each other. I know.
I've been hanging out in the wrong cities, given my proclivities.
Well, it seems like it hasn't slowed you down, Andrew, so I don't know.
Thanks. Thank you. To backtrack a little bit, the data that I keep saying is that Gen Z or whoever's in college is having less sex than preceding generations. Why is that? Is that they only know apps and so they're just not meeting people? Is it like it could be a weirdly positive thing? I think it's a good thing that the incoming generation drinks less. That seems to me to be overall beneficial, but there is a certain amount of social lubrication that's involved in meeting people. So like what accounts for that decline in sexuality with our younger peers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody really knows for sure, but it is like you mentioned, they don't drink as often. They also are much less likely to have a job. They're also less likely to smoke cigarettes. They drive less often. More of them can't drive at all or don't drive at all. They spend a lot more time on video games and social media. And so that's kind of the main theory that I think it's like a combination of more helicopter parenting. So they have less free time, teenagers, especially in the top half. They have a lot of activities and tutoring and test prep that they've got to do. And then there's a lot of fear around letting your kids out of the house. I think that didn't exist when we were growing up or was much chiller. And then Yeah, they're just we're kind of delaying, we're kind of extending childhood farther and farther. And so I think all of this is having an impact on how much sex teens are having.
That could be. I wonder if there's a time lag phenomenon, like to kind of jump the ship when we get into like economics, for example, when we talk about wage gap. A lot of wage gap, I think, can be accounted for in part because of just age cohorts. So like right now, if you're going to look at the top performing attorneys, you're going to find that they're male, but they're also in their 60s and 70s. If you look at incoming attorneys, they're female heavy. So in 20, 30 years, you're going to find that on average, the attorneys that are making more money are female because the numbers are flipping. But that is to a large extent an artifact of just age cohorts do not immediately change. So I wonder if that will not change for some of those people. Like I was not sexually active in high school or college. Like I made out in college, but I was, I delayed my own apparently colorful, storied sex life until after that. So maybe they'll catch up. Maybe they'll, likewise like me, be a late bloomer.
Yeah, maybe. It's hard to say. I remember I read this somewhere, and I can't remember where, and maybe I made it up. Maybe I heard it in a dream. But somewhere I heard that the most effective contraceptive was when they would introduce television to remote Indian villages. That that's when fertility would drop off a cliff, is when every Indian house had a TV inside. And when you look at like Bowling Alone, Putnam's main conclusion is civil society was killed by television. Yep. So I am a little bit skeptical that this is merely a cohort issue. I do think that and I'm not making the argument that like social media is to blame or smartphones are to blame. And I don't think that that's Putnam's argument either. But I don't think that it would be wise to not consider the impact of what are the alternatives that kids and adults have to having sex today that we didn't have. I'm like, dial-up internet was not as compelling a way to spend time as a smartphone is, right?
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm a big Robert Putnam fan, and I think there is something to that. I think that there is a strong correlation with the atrophy of boring-free civil intermediate institutions, which is to say things that are neither work nor government, and television. And that bears out in the data. It bears out anecdotally for me when I move to new cities and I'm readjusting to life in the D.C. area. It's very easy to just stay home and drink a beer and watch something on Netflix or Star Trek. There's a variety of content available. It takes zero effort, 0 calories, and it's psychically taxing to go do other stuff. Last week, I did two-stepping when I was in Austin, and I wanted to do two-stepping again. So I found a place called Colvin Dance Hall in Virginia, and I drove out there. So I had to drive. And then there's this, even though everybody's friendly, and also everybody but me was 73 and married, so it wasn't as if this was a particularly daunting group of people. But even then, there was a certain level of shyness that I had in going up asking these nice ladies to dance. And it required me having to go, ooh, okay, fear of rejection. And again, these are low stakes, but there's none with TV. So I could totally see. And again, I was the only guy there that was under probably 68. There were maybe 3 or 4 women, but there weren't any guys my age that were there. Everybody, but I kind of get it. So I think maybe TV is implicating that to some extent. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a similar thing where I went dancing with my friend, and I realized afterwards, we were salsa dancing, and we were trying to talk to each other because these were people I hadn't met before. And so I wanted to talk to them. But between having to be right up to their face and the fact that you have to speak loudly because of the music, I realized we're just breathing and spitting right in each other's mouths. This is disgusting, actually.
Yeah.
But I feel like this is a concern born of convenience, or born of the alternative being I can just sit in my condo for days on end and not see another human except for my partner, Rob. And so Yeah, it's just, it used to be there wasn't anything compelling keeping us inside, and we had to get out to like buy things and earn money and, be a part of the world. And that's just increasingly not true.
Well, I'm like a cripplingly high extrovert. So I have to go out or I will get depressed. And so I have to go do these things. But for people that have a more balanced internal life, I don't think that they're quite as compelled to. Although I'm going to give you a pass on the dancing thing. Two-stepping's lovely and very social, and I like swing dancing as well. I hate clubs. I hate clubbing. Like, in my 20s, I would get invited to go clubbing, and I would be like, so we're going to go dry hump strangers in an epileptic sweat box, and I can't talk to them. The one thing I can do is talk. It's the only thing I can do. And all I can shout is, what's your favorite color? And a woman that I hate that. Young people, you get a pass on clubbing. Clubbing is stupid. Well, we'll move away from sex specifically in a moment. But final question before we move on to marriage: are there other myths about sex in our culture that you have spotted that we could either empirically push back on, or disprove?
How much time do you have?
Much as you want.
It's dangerous. Oh my gosh, so many. Going back to the whole, why does everybody think everybody's having more sex, and the fact that I was taught explicitly that men are always horny. They always want sex. They want it with everyone at all times. If you're ever alone with a man, he's going to try to have sex with you, and you need to be prepared, and you really shouldn't be alone with him because whatever. And that's really
Mike
pernicious.
Pence seems like a horny dude. I don't think you should be in the same room with Mike Pence. This is a real strategy here.
He's got grit. I was going to say I could take him, but he's got grit, so I'll give him that.
Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. No, people really believe this, and they really tell young girls this, and young girls believe it until they hear otherwise. And it's really damaging for the women, obviously, because then you meet these men who don't want to have sex with you, and you're like, well, something's wrong with one of us. And then you're a man, you grew up in that culture, and it's like you feel like ashamed if you don't want to have sex with everything that moves, and you feel like you can't admit it. It's like, oh, did you try to have sex with that girl on the date? And you got to be like, yeah. And and it's just on the one hand, I think that when women grow up and they don't hear those things, it kind of puts them at a disadvantage in terms of being a little bit naive, especially when you encounter men who've received that programming and women who haven't. But the reality is everyone is an individual, right? Like all men are one way and all women are another way. Some women have a really high sex drive. Some men have a really low sex drive. Some people are really, they're demi and they need to have an emotional connection to want to have sex. Some people, I'm kind of more like this a lot of the times. The more I get to know somebody, the less I want to have sex with them often. So yeah, it is true that men are hornier than women on average, but
okay. I was
there's
about
a
to
lot
ask
of
that,
variation.
I was about to say I'm very big on individualizing and humanizing everybody, but I feel like aggregately when we're looking at sex drive, and my understanding is testosterone is the main chemical in terms of being libidinous, that testosterone is significantly higher. So there is a we could say generally on average men have higher sex drive than women, but we would want to put in some asterisks there of like not every man is trying to hump everything that moves at all times.
Not every man is, and there's nothing wrong with the men who aren't. That doesn't mean that they're not straight or that they're not men, or this is just one of the many ways in which masculinity really harms men, and that if they aren't horny, well, then that's feminine. You can't be feminine. And so we have to pretend or cover up or be ashamed. And it's just not necessary.
One of the things that we talked about the last time you were on the program 6 years ago, but it stuck with me, was you brought up the patriarchy a couple of times, and I asked you to define it at one point. I'll probably butcher the actual definition here, but you were clear in saying, like, I'm not talking about men. I'm talking about a system. And the system that I'm describing is one that hurts both men and women. And I was like, oh, there have been a lot of unnecessary arguments I've had using a different definition of that. But I do think there's a lot to that. I know that in your newsletter you point out that you think men get get punished for violating gender norms more than women. And I think that that's true. Like, to the point where I think homophobia is at root kind of just misogyny. Like, you go back to the ancient Roman world, and an insult was to call someone a fellator, like a fellator. And it wasn't an insult to be a guy ever putting, listeners, apologies, I'm going to have to use terminology here. Putting your dick in somebody that's fine. You're being the man. Put your dick in anybody. But the person receiving it is being the woman. And if you're a man acting like a woman, like, that's horrible. But it was all rooted in don't be a woman. It wasn't, there's anything wrong with gay sex as long as you're pitching.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm going to come back to gender in a minute because I think this is a really interesting topic, but I want to get into marriage for a bit because we've got a lot of stats on that. So I know marriage rates have declined. Why?
Oh, man. Well,
well, and let me, it's my understanding also that the divorce rate's actually not that high. Like, our divorce rate's about what it was in the 50s, but our marriage rate is really, really low. Am I right in that?
So as it turns out, marriage and divorce especially, they're like kind of hard to measure. Mm-hmm. But no, there is no evidence as far as I can tell that the divorce rate is higher than it was 50 years ago, certainly 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. Divorce really climbed in the 70s, and I think it's actually down since the 70s.
Yeah.
So... yeah. No, it's definitely not that more people are divorced. It's a lot of people just not getting married. And the important thing to know about marriage and divorce is that it's extremely different when you're looking at the top and the bottom half. So when I say the top half, I mean of income and education. So people who are earning 50% or more of their area median income, and people who have bachelor's degrees versus people who are earning...
We're not making an ontological statement of shitty people and awesome people. We're talking income and education, whether you're in the top half or the bottom half where you live. Yeah?
That's correct. I am not making moral claims at this time. Check back.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so hierarchically, these people are in the top half. So they are getting married at about the same rate that they always have. People with degrees, so men and women with degrees. And importantly, people with degrees and who earn top half wages pretty much only marry other people who have degrees and earn top half wages. So it used to be that you would have these interstatus marriages where people would marry people of different classes than them. And that's less true today than it has been in the past.
It's like the Don Draper model where the executive marries the hot secretary, even though she graduated high school and not college, but they're both good looking. They live in the same town. They marry, they have kids. That now, Don Draper marries the female executive across the hall, and they both have a power couple relationship where they both pull $300,000 a year.
That's exactly right. Obviously, there are exceptions, but on average, yes, that's how it works today. So those people also, people with degrees and top half marriages tend to last. They tend to have very low rates of divorce. So they're getting married at the same rate. They're divorcing at a lower rate than in decades past.
Okay.
If you look at the bottom half, people who don't have degrees and people who earn less than 50% of area median income, they are the ones who are not getting married. By and large, their marriage rate has fallen off a cliff. And that's where you see the averages. So when we say the marriage rate is down, what is actually true is that the marriage rate is down for the bottom half so much that you can see it across, like it looks like it's a phenomenon that's happening across, but it's not. It's happening in the bottom half. And they're more likely to get divorced.
As well?
Yes.
Right.
People who are in the bottom half and get married, their marriages last much shorter on average.
Interesting. This kind of like dovetails with Tim Carney. Like he wrote a book called Alienated America a few years ago.
Girl, I talk about that book all the time. Nice. I love that book.
Well, so the thing, like I was already on board with the premise of that, being a good Robert Putnam fan, of America's becoming alienated and isolated. I think that this is a really big problem. I think we are living in an extremely lonely time period of history. And one of the things that Tim pointed out that kind of bucked my overall doom and gloom thinking there was That is not true of upper class people or upper middle class people, as we would say in America. That communities in which you are doing well above the median income, which is this year $80,000 a year, I think, per individual. So if you're at a community where people are earning $120K and higher and they have at least a college degree, the rates of alienation, isolation, and loneliness are actually very low. It's not something that's universal. It is something that is highly correlated with socioeconomic status. And it's interesting to me that that also correlates with both divorce and marriage. Because if I'm reading you right, people that are in that top half are marrying same rate as ever, if not higher, and the divorce rates are very low. So like marriage is working well as an institution for them. Marriage is something harder for people to get into if they're in the bottom half and they're more likely to divorce?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Why?
I would say, if I had to sum it up, and I've written many, many words trying to figure this out, but essentially the male breadwinner model. So we in American society have this idea that marriages should have a male breadwinner, meaning the man needs to earn more money than the woman. And in the top half, this works out to where the man will often earn much to a little bit more than the woman, right? Because that's what people want, and that works out fine. In the bottom half, where female wages have risen dramatically since 1970. Female labor force participation has increased radically since 1970. The social and legal impediments to singledom have decreased dramatically since 1970. And male wages in the bottom half and male labor force participation among prime age men in the bottom half have both fallen since, well, you could say they stagnated for wages. Labor force participation has fallen, depending on who you talk to, whatever. But anyway,
whichever
women
party's
are
out
doing
of power uses the participation rate. Whichever party's in power uses unemployment. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But essentially, men are doing not better. Women need them less. And so men have not made up for what they didn't gain in labor force participation and wages by like taking on more childcare, doing more domestic labor, like being a good partner in any other way, going to therapy and figuring out how to be emotionally there for their wives. Actually, what you find in bottom half marriages, actually in marriages generally, where the woman out earns the man, that in those marriages, those men are more likely to cheat on their wives, more likely to physically assault their wives. They do less childcare and domestic labor than men who earn more than their wives.
Okay, this is fascinating, and this starts to make some intuitive sense to me. So, like anecdotally, I was dating a gal back when you and I met. And she had way more money than me at that time. And I ended up working for her for a little bit. And I didn't like it. It really bothered me. I think in part because my income was directly dependent on my girlfriend, which felt a little suffocating. But I would imagine that there was also just a certain level of like, I don't like that you are earning more, have more money than me and that kind of thing. Now I'm doing much better in my life career-wise, I think, and I'm in the top half if we're using national medians. I think now if I dated a gal that was making more money than me, it wouldn't bother me nearly as much because it'd be like, oh, well, we're both earning a decent amount of money. This is great. You've got some play money. I think I would think that. I would certainly be more comfortable with it now being in the top half than I was when I was in the bottom half, where it was less abstract and more of like, oh, I can't do anything. And it sounds like, additionally, that the plight of men on the bottom half has really lagged. And so if there is any type of problem that results from having that inverted breadwinner model, that's going to fall disproportionately on the bottom half guys.
Exactly. Yeah. They feel a lot of masculinity threat from having their wives out earn them. And it's to the point where women will actually, again, this is borne out in the data, turn down promotions, turn down opportunities for jobs work fewer hours, do all kinds of things to avoid becoming a breadwinner because they know that it's going to really mess up their home lives to become a breadwinner in their homes.
Do we know if this is entirely a male problem? And I ask because, I had Musa Al-Garbi on the program maybe 6 months ago who wrote We've Never Been Woke. He brought up this issue that that the data I think is pretty solid based on what you've told me and what Musa told me, that relationships where the woman out-earns the man tend to be less stable. But it wasn't clear on reading his book whether that was because men are insecure or whether women prefer it. And so I would love to date a 7-foot-tall woman. I think that would be awesome. I'd love to try that out. Could be amazing. I don't know, right? But I feel like most of the gals I know would prefer to have a guy taller than her. And so I don't – do we know if this is both genders want the dude to earn more, just the men, women? What's your feel on that?
As far as I can tell, there's no difference. Yeah, I haven't seen any data that would indicate that this is gendered. So I think, yes, both men and women prefer a male breadwinner model.
In one of your newsletters that I read recently, you said that there's a supply and demand problem for male breadwinners in the bottom half. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, yeah, just in the top half, there are a lot of men who can bring a paycheck to their marriage. And so that's fine. There's not a supply and demand problem there. Everybody wants it. Most people have it. Not everybody wants it, but the people who want it, most by and large, get it. In the bottom half, there are a lot more men who either their paycheck isn't big enough, they're not in the labor force at all, their work is too seasonal and unpredictable to make the paycheck a big draw for them as a husband. So you've got a lot of people who would love their husbands to marry a man who could bring home a steady paycheck upon which, they could build a life. And there just aren't enough of those men to go around in the bottom half, which is a huge part of why marriage rates and are down and rates of single motherhood are up. And then there's the issue of in and amongst the bottom half of men, you also have the issue of everything is on a distribution. And when I say everything, I mean a propensity toward violence. I mean narcissism, psychopathy. I mean schizophrenia, right? All of those things are more commonly found in men than women. And so you've got this, bottom 10, 5, 10, 20% of men in terms of marriageability, like men you really nobody wants to be married to. Again, because they're violent, narcissists, psychopaths, et cetera. And they, again, outnumber the women who are similarly unmarriageable. So that's another reason why there's a discrepancy and why it's found so much more in the bottom half.
Okay. So, all right, if I'm getting this right so far, if you're in the top half and you want a male breadwinner, you're far more likely in the top half, qua top half, to find a guy that has a job. It would be difficult to be in the top half and not have a job, and to very likely also have a comparable level of degree, a bachelor's, master's, something like that. If you're in the bottom half, that would include unemployed, underemployed, gig workers, guys that are struggling on the economic periphery, which is very different than being on the upper end periphery of do I buy a helicopter or not? So you've got a whole clump of guys that just can't participate economically, and so ladies that might be comfortable having lower income or are comfortable having lower income than their guy, they're having to look towards the men in their community that have it. So very different looking at Bethesda, Maryland versus Scabies County, Ohio, in the Rust Belt district, because maybe there's just lower employment levels, things like that. And you compound that with the comorbidity factors you brought up, like narcissism, sociopathy. They're just higher in men, which means that there's less acceptable men, that there's not gender parity. Therefore, the women are seeking after a smaller pool of guys rather than vice versa?
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
And again, everything is on a distribution. So there are also more men among the very smartest, most capable people. So again, but they're marrying top half women. So you've got the sociopaths on the bottom. Then you've got the sociopaths who are CEOs at the top, right? But one is much better to be married to than the other.
If you're gonna pick a sociopath, pick a rich one. If you're gonna pick a sociopath, go for the one with the helicopter over the one that is hanging out of the dive bar. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. So, people are making rational decisions based on their options. And so I don't think that there are only two paths forward. You can make men more marriageable, either by changing the standards that we use to decide who to marry, changing what men are bringing to the table, or you can go back to how it used to be, which is that we just forced women to marry and hopefully you got a good one.
And when you say we forced women to marry, you go way back, that was literally the case. Women were like kind of cattle or pets where we would trade and swap them as part of a marriage contract. But more recently in American history, when you say forced, before we had birth control, and if you got pregnant, you had a kid, so you needed to lock something down, or just once you got married, it was very difficult to get divorced. Just kind of elaborate on the two different models, please.
Yeah, it's a combination of things. So there was a lot of stigma against being an unmarried woman.
Right. There are all these weird references to Reno from the 1960s. Like whenever anybody got divorced in like a play, like they'd become a waitress in Reno for 6 months because Reno, like you could get residency there within 3 months. And it was like the only place in America you could get a no contest divorce. But you'll see these weird Reno references peppered all over 50s, 60s, 70s.
How interesting. I did not know that. Yeah. So no-fault divorce, that was obviously something that helped women avoid being married if they didn't want to be. The fact that a woman couldn't take out a credit card in her own name until the 70s, couldn't get a mortgage, right? That obviously is going to encourage women to get into and stay into marriages if they can't access credit outside of a marriage. And then just the fact that the opportunities for earning were so much more limited for women. All that kind of conspired to, obviously women weren't forced at gunpoint, but if you make the alternatives hard to access and artificially unpleasant, then it's a kind of coercion.
Yeah, I see that. It was much more difficult to be an independent woman in the 1950s than it is now. It was possible, but much harder, particularly if you wanted to have a certain level of affluence. It's one of the, weird silver linings for people that are worried about marriage today. I think by and large, people are getting married because they just really like the person. Like at this point in my life, I'm 41. I would like to get married. If and when that occurs, it'll be because I really like the lady. It won't be because I don't know how to make a sandwich or clean a bathroom. And it's beyond my ability to ever run a household without a partner. Like I would love to partner up, but it will be because I want to. It won't be a necessity. And that's, I think, true for most people at this point.
It is. It's a double-edged sword, though, because what we're seeing is people are mistaking the things associated with marriage with marriage causing those things. So people who get married and stay married are, on average, exceptions exist, but on average, happier, healthier, smarter, more conscientious, less mentally ill, less physically ill. All these things that you would want and that are associated with good outcomes for themselves and their children. But marriage didn't cause you to be a person who gets along with other people and cares about their fellow man. It's a thing that you're just more likely to do because that's the kind of person you are.
Right. It's correlation, not causal.
Exactly. And so, yeah, when you get two highly functional people together and you get them married, especially in a culture that is kind of built around the nuclear family, it works out well for them. But when you try to force two people who would otherwise not be married into a marriage, you don't get the same outcomes. And so promoting marriage doesn't make sense because it doesn't cause people to live better lives. It's associated with better lives for the people who enter into it voluntarily.
That is fascinating, and I want to make sure I understand this. So for the moment, let us assume I, Bachelor Andrew Heaton, am a high-functioning, emotionally stable, desirable adult. We'll just assume that is the case. Were I to get married, it would be a net positive for me and presumably my partner, who is also a high-functioning, intelligent, attractive individual with income and education. We are forming a partnership that is clearly a net positive. And there's data that like married men earn more money than unmarried men. My income probably wouldn't change that much because it's not that the marriage makes you wealthier. It's that the sort of person who's apt to be earning more is also the sort of person to attract a mate or want to get married and attract a mate. So for top half people, good institution. This is a good pairing that will likely have a positive outcome. If you're in the bottom half, the benefits are not as good. If so, why? Or why not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, one of the biggest reasons is because they're so much more likely to divorce, and people are pretty much always worse off after they divorce than before they got married. So getting married and then getting divorced it's not a good thing for them or their kids.
Emotionally traumatic and also very expensive. Yeah,
exactly. And just if you are not doing super great, most marriages are assortative. You're probably going to marry somebody who's also not doing super great. And together, the two of you generally don't do a lot better. That's just, those marriages are much more likely to be high conflict. It's more stressful to be a person who's in the bottom half, especially in a society that doesn't have an adequate social safety net. And so you've got two people who aren't navigating life all that well, who have a harder thing to navigate because their lives are harder, which puts more stress on them as individuals and on their marriage. They're much less likely to have supportive institutions. So the top half, like you said, they're the ones who organize civil society. This is something that, like you were pointing out about Alienated America and Bowling Alone, the top half organizes civil society. And so these institutions that benefit marriages and that marriages benefit those institutions, churches, PTAs, Kiwanis clubs, the sex positive society, social groups that I had in San Francisco. For the most part, bottom half people don't have access to those institutions either. So yeah, I mean, marriage isn't magic, right? Like it's a result more than a cause of the good things that we want to see.
One of the things that you've brought up in your newsletter a few times that really made me think was you've posited that we ought to think of marriage as two separate institutions. The bottom half marriage and top half marriage are just different things. And that when I start thinking of it that way for top half people, this is a great stable thing. For bottom half people, it's more likely that there are problematic pairings that are going to cause friction as opposed to net positive. It also kind of, it adds some complexity to the oft-touted, the cure for poverty is graduate high school, wait to get married before you have a kid, which the data I think is pretty good on that. Like you should graduate high school, and if you're going to have a kid, get married first. The kid's way more likely, but that advice would work really well for a top half person. But if the other people that you're marrying potentially have big problems, that may not be good advice. I mean,
breaking news, poor people don't need advice. They need help. This is so frustrating to me. This has been something that's irritated me since I was in DC. It was I want to say it was like my first or second year. So I guess it was 2011 or 2012. And I get invited to speak on a panel about single motherhood for the Heritage Foundation. And I was so naive that I'm sitting on the panel. And that's when I realized that this whole thing is just to shit on single mothers. And I'm like,
so they were doing like the whole Murphy Brown treatment. Like Dan Quayle came out and was like, these single mothers, but they were villainizing them.
Yes. In the 20-teens, they were villainizing single mothers. And you still see this. In 2025, I just read a report villainizing. I mean, it was it was chiller than that. But essentially, it was like, what do we do about these single moms? And it's like, telling them to act like top half people is not going to work. It didn't work in 1970. It didn't work in 2013. It's not going to work in 2025. You can't tell people, behave like you're in the top half of intelligence. Behave like you're in the top half of mental health. Behave like you're in the top half of conscientiousness. Behave like you were born into wealth. That doesn't, no. You have to set up institutions. You have to set up processes and systems that can help these people, because it's not the same for them. Would that it were. Would that we could just bully people into getting married and that would fix all social ills, but we can't, because that's not them. The idea that this is a cultural issue is so insane to me, because for that to be true, it would have to be true that the top half valorizes marriage while the bottom half shits on it. The opposite is true. If anything, the top half shits on marriage and the bottom half valorizes it. But because this isn't a values problem.
Socially traditional in terms of your ideology and worldview. If you're in the lower socioeconomic half, you're much more likely to be libertine and go to Burning Man and be a part of a throuple, and go to Cathy's cool sex parties that I've never been invited to if you're part of the top half. And so that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Well, can I play devil's advocate with you for a minute? Acknowledging that correlation and causation are not the same thing. I do think the data is pretty good that a two-partner home offers more stability, financial security. Is there not something to be said for pairing up for somebody and having a more indelible commitment is likely to result in security both for you as a partner and for your kids, and therefore marriage would still be a good idea if you have a kid out of wedlock?
Marriage to whom?
Well, one would assume the guy that you got pregnant with, or one of your other male friends in your community.
Right. These women are getting pregnant and they're deciding it's better to not be married to the man who impregnated me. And to say to those women, no, you're making the wrong choice, without looking at who the men are who are available to these women, that's what drives me insane. These women aren't irrational. They're looking at their options
Gotcha.
and making a rational choice. That this man who got me pregnant often has a record, is often addicted to drugs, is often violent, is often intermittently employed, right? Is not contributing at home, is not doing childcare, is not doing domestic labor. So he's a net cost. So she's making a rational choice that being married to this man is going to make my life worse on net. And so just telling her value marriage more is incredibly insulting.
So you're having the fascinating perspective that they might have thought of this and decided that whoever the guy that is currently sleeping off the hangover on the couch may not actually be a good wagon to tether to. It's not because they watched Murphy Brown and went, I hate men. it's that they think this guy is not going to be a positive source of income or emotional stability for me or my child. I do not want to enter a long-term contract with him. That would be deleterious, something like that.
I'm saying it's worth considering.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Okay. I'm going to swing back a minute. We touched on gender a minute ago. And I wanted, this is a whole big topic. We don't have to go too far on this because you've already been very generous with your time. Actually, you know what, Cathy? Come to think of it, we're at 57 minutes. We're at an hour. Do you want to get into gender, or should I put a pin in this and cut out that bit?
No, let's do it. Let's do it.
Okay. I appreciate that. Okay. So this is a really big question. Are genders real? And what I mean by that, listeners, I want to clarify this. Sex is real. There are genitals. They're correlated with X chromosomes and Y chromosomes. There are exceptions, but they're, very large for the overall population. So I'm not saying sex isn't real. I do think there's aggregated behaviors which are associated with either sex that we could call like an innate gender. But then there's a bunch of bullshit. Like in like 1900, blue and red were up for grabs in terms of which one was male, which one was female. Like pink was considered by a lot of people like that's the more male color because pink is like blood, but it's just a little bit lighter because they're kids. But pink is for boys, right? Like we didn't as a culture even decide blue and pink were gendered until like around 1930 or so, right? And if you were to go to India right now, my guess is that they have a very different interpretation of bright pink, which appears to be their navy blue. My guess is that that's not considered as effeminate as we think of it. So anyway, that's kind of where my head's at. I think there's a thing to gender, but I think there's a lot of bullshit in it. I think you've thought about this more than me, so I would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, totally. So there's a thing called, the way I describe it is like sex differences. So these are empirically measured differences between people that correspond to what we describe as biological sex. And the two biggest are sex and violence. So men are, across cultures and across time, pretty much always a little bit more violent and horny than women on average. Again, these are averages, okay. Exceptions exist, but generally speaking, men are more violent. They're more aggressive. They're more risk tolerant, especially when it comes to like physical safety. Men are more, they think about sex more often. They're more open to having sex with a greater number of people. They want to have sex more often than women on average. Everything else is a little more tenuous. So they found sex differences in behavior. Men, for example, tend to be less compassionate, less able to describe their emotions, things like that. But they're not quite as universal over space and time. So that would indicate...
It's not clear how much of that is cultural versus innate.
Exactly. So I think that at the end of the day, gender is the group of assumptions we make about someone based on what we believe their biological sex is. And I just think that it's more trouble than it's worth. Like, does it exist? Probably. But I look at it like gender is to race as like gender and race are constructs that relate to biological realities, which is sex and skin color. So the melanin content of your skin is a biological fact.
Your phenotypical traits are something that we can confirm, like whether you are darker skinned or lighter skinned, but the race is a social construct that we've drawn. We've made a constellation based on arbitrary data points that we picked. And that's what race is.
Right. And some of those, again, it is true that people who have dark skin are at greater risk of developing hemophilia than people with light skin. And it is true that people with light skin burn more easily in the sun than people with dark skin. Like these are differences in the way that our bodies function. And you can say that like Black people are more likely to speak Ebonics than white people, and women are more likely to talk about their feelings than men. How much of that is biologically determined is unclear. And so I just think that like at the end of the day, our race and gender, like, again, more or less trouble than they're worth. Like, do we need our skin color and our assumptions about our sex to be so much more salient to the assumptions we make about each other than our eye color? You know, and I don't think so. I don't think that that's necessary or helpful necessarily. Yeah.
Interesting. If we were to take that direction as a society, how would that manifest? What would it look like?
Yeah. I mean, one thing is I think it would be really interesting to see, you know, is there any biological basis to the fact that men have a harder time talking about their feelings than women on average?
I don't think that's one where I feel very sorry for a lot of older guys. I'm 41. My friends are all wonderfully emotionally receptive. Like, I had a family crisis last week. I do not want to talk about it, but I called 3 or 4 of my male friends within a day. They're like, I'll start crying. That would have been fine. I'm almost crying with you, Cathy. they would have been totally receptive to me crying. I have multiple friends where when we hang up the phone, it's like, goodbye, I'll talk to you later, I love you. And like, it's just very common for us. But like that doesn't, so that to me intuitively does not feel like something where my ability to articulate my emotions is something that is somehow juxtaposed to my sex. That seems like a cultural thing that we did.
I think so. I think that when you look at history, for example, and obviously the problem is that you're a tales man. You're not an average man. The people who we read about in history
I am.
are tales men and women. But you see a lot more intimacy between men. There was no homo, in the Civil War. Men shared a bed and they shared their feelings and it was all fine. So I think one of the things that we could do if we got rid of gender or made it a lot less salient is it would really help the male loneliness crisis. Like you said, you've got all these men you can call and be emotionally vulnerable with. Surveys report that a large and growing percentage of men don't have a single friend they feel like they could call with big news, good or bad. And that's awful.
Very sad.
It's very sad.
Yeah.
And it's so obvious to me looking back. It's like we've coded everything that is required to be emotionally close to another person as feminine. Vulnerability, being in touch with your feelings, being willing to ask for help, being present, like all these things. Men are supposed to be stoic. They're supposed to be lone wolves. They're supposed to be invincible.
But can I intervene there too? I was talking to one of my friends about this the other day. I think the stoic thing's really funny because you will hear guys say things like, well, my generation, we're just more stoical. We don't show emotion. And I'm like, yeah, except for anger. You show a lot of anger. But when we talk about like men being stoical, anger doesn't count. Anger is an emotion. There are a lot of really angry dudes that just don't show vulnerability. But anger is an emotion. Spock's not angry.
Totally. No, and that's because that's masculine. Anger, aggression, competition, these are coded masculine. Collaboration, that's coded feminine.
Okay, interesting. So you're thinking there's probably some combination of real biological traits or at least statistical aggregated propensity towards behaviors, but there's also a bunch of gobbledygook nonsense, correlations, not causation, that kind of thing. And just you're thinking overall, it's not worth trying to suss out the two, that this is such a mess of a category, like when we were doing phrenology with race and bullshit like that we should just move away from it?
What I'm saying is that biological sex is, gender is should. So biological sex says men are more horny than women on average. Gender says men shouldn't cry. Men shouldn't not be horny all the time. Men shouldn't be vulnerable. Men shouldn't show too much affection to their friends. Men shouldn't perform femininity, right, in any way, shape, or form. And once you're putting shoulds on people based on your assumptions about their genitals, how stupid is that? Why would I be required to act in a specific way because of what you think I have between my legs? That's silly.
Yeah, you know what? Fair. I think I've never thought of it in terms of we should move away from gender so much. That's kind of a new idea to me. I've always thought of it more, and this is all molten for me. This is all I'm still figuring this out on my end. I'm not trying to argue with you. But I've always just kind of thought of it on my end, there's a bunch of different masculinities. Clearly, I am not ding, spitting and spittoon hard hat guy. I'm regal masculine. But that, and I feel like that's given me a lot of latitude where I am able to contextualize myself of I'm very masculine the way Prince Philip was. But I'm able to kind of do that. That's interesting to think of it I don't have any should for other people. I don't want people to be emotionally incontinent, but it's not a gendered thing. I find it irritating regardless. If you are becoming so emotional that you're irrational, that is irritating to me regardless of your chromosomes. I don't know, if you're a guy that wants to do stuff that I think, I don't give a shit. Like I'm very much, as long as you're not hurting anybody, I'm all for everybody doing whatever makes them happy. So maybe the should be lessened a bit.
It's also so, again, classed, right? Because men in the top half of society can perform femininity. They have the safety. Yeah. The whole point of gender is hierarchy. So it's to establish a gender-based hierarchy of men are over women, and the more masculine men are over the more feminine men. That's why in like Greece and Rome, it was okay to be a giver and not a receiver, because it's about power essentially at its core.
Interesting.
So, if you're in the top half of society, you can wear a dress on the cover of Vogue like Harry Styles, and you can be into talking about your feelings because you're safe. I had a friend who makes furry costumes. That's his like hobby. And he was like, well, I feel like in the old day, 10, 20 years ago, men were punished for performing femininity, but not anymore. And I'm like, my brother in Christ, you have surrounded yourself with people who are okay with you performing femininity. And like, congratulations. But like, go to Enterprise, Alabama and go to a factory floor and tell them you make furry costumes. That's your hobby. Like, see how that is received. And so
interesting.
The reality,
so like in my case, me living in a large metropolitan area. I was just in Austin. Now I'm in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I'm hanging out with top half people. I'm not going to get any reprisal for going like, maybe I'll try eyeliner. I don't know. But if I were living in Scabies County, Oklahoma, which lovely people, but all the same, like that might be, there might be more social repercussions to it. Like to the point where I kind of think that it's almost like a power move. Like if you're a guy and you're dressing effeminately, like if I were to wear like a lot of pink, like I'm almost challenging dudes to like come up and like, hey, like, look, I'm dressing like a woman and I can get away with it. Whereas like, but it's, I don't know. Sometimes I almost think there's like a challenging element that I do think is correlated with socioeconomics or correlated with like, I'm high up in the hierarchy, so I can flout this gender norm and I'm challenging you to even attempt to get me in trouble for it. But
exactly.
It helps a lot if you've got money to do that.
It's a flex. Femininity is a flex for top half men. Yes.
You said that gender exists as a hierarchy. I talked to somebody a few years ago, and I like what they had to said, where they didn't think that it was better to be a man than a woman in all situations. They thought that it was the tiebreaker, but that it was better socioeconomically to just be rich. So her point was like, all things considered, between a Harvard graduate that's a man or a woman, probably better to be the man, but still better in society to be a female Harvard graduate than the guy in Scabies County. I was taken with that. That seemed to be about right in my experience of like better to have education and income. But if you're, again, all things considered, the privilege is going to default on the man. Does that resonate with you, or would you have a different hierarchy that you would outline?
I think the thing that I would say is something that Celeste Davis pointed out. She's a writer on Substack recently, which is that the point of masculinity is to reify a gender hierarchy, but it really only benefits a small minority of men. That masculinity doesn't even benefit most men. Most men are harmed on net by masculinity. If it were all so natural, we wouldn't have to beat people up for not doing it correctly. We wouldn't have to violently enforce it. And it doesn't require every man to enforce masculinity. It only takes one who's willing to beat you up to get you to conform. And so I just think that saying I would rather be a man or I would rather be a woman, like, I don't know, it's very contextual. What I would rather be is a human who wasn't punished for failing to meet people's expectations based on what they think my gender is.
Fair. Can you clarify too, when you say masculine, like I feel that I dress and act in a very masculine way, and I like the way that I dress and act. I do not feel attacked when you say that masculinity is holding people back, but there might be guys that are listening to the podcast who do feel that way. So are you using masculinity as a proxy for toxic masculinity or for just gendered language in general, or kind of, I want to make sure I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, that's a good, I forget not everybody has come along my full journey with me, but masculinity, I'm not talking about a collection of traits. I don't have any beef with whatever you think.
Me being a baritone wearing a blazer, you don't have an issue with.
Whatever, okay. That's fine. Being horny and aggressive, like, obviously that's fine with me. But what I'm talking about, again, is the ought. It's the should. It's the pressure to perform. That is what gender is. And so when we talk about toxic masculinity, it's a contradiction in terms. It's a non sequitur, because in order for a thing called toxic masculinity to exist, you'd have to have a thing called positive masculinity. And you'd also have to have toxic femininity and toxic or positive femininity. And there is no reality in which positive masculinity isn't synonymous with femininity, because a trait cannot be gendered equally masculine and feminine at the same time, or it ceases to be gendered at all. That's the entire point of a dichotomy, is it's one or the other. So if a trait signifies masculinity, it cannot simultaneously and to an equal extent signify femininity. So I'm not saying these traits are good or bad. I don't care. What I'm saying is that why are we associating them with a dick? Like, aggression is not good or bad. It's good or bad depending on the circumstances, nor should it be good or bad depending on the genitalia of the person exhibiting it. What I'm saying is that what's bad is the pressure to be masculine, to embody masculinity, if it's not natural for you, or if it's not the right thing to do in that circumstance.
Okay. Yeah, and just as you were talking, like I was in my head, I was trying to come up with a rapid model of like what toxic masculinity and toxic femininity would look like, and just immediately I was like, I'm just thinking of an asshole. That's what I'm thinking of. Like it's like because I have in my head a very irritating woman who's very aggressive and mean and assertive, and a very aggressive, mean and assertive guy, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're just being dicks. That's the problem. I don't have a like just don't be an asshole. That's the toxic bit. And I like your overall position. I think you phrased it well and better than I'm going to paraphrase it, but it's the sort of compulsory expectation that's the problem. Like, again, fine with me being like weird throwback 1950s dude that has baritone voice, likes wearing blazers. But I'm doing it because I like to do it, and I don't expect other men to do it. I want everybody to be happy. So like, if other guys don't want to do that, that's fine. So okay. We'll wrap up here in a moment, Cathy. Final question: is there anything about sex, gender, or marriage that guys get wrong, or that gals get wrong, that you would like to say something about before we sign off?
I guess none of it's magic, and the things that you're seeing aren't necessarily representative of reality. So marriages aren't all happy or sad. What you see, generally speaking, are the extremes. You see the happiest marriages and the saddest marriages. You see the worst dating stories and the best dating stories. You see the people who have the most sex and the people who have the least sex. So you have like the sluts and the incels. But that's not reality. That's a minority of the population and a minority of human experience. Reality is much more varied and boring than what you see online and what your friends tell you, because they're not gonna tell you about the boring things, so nobody wants to hear it. I don't know if that's worth saying.
I really like that. Don't freak out and get better at math, I think is a really good primer for almost all conversations about culture and social lives. Yeah.
Good. Great.
All right. Well, we will wrap up there then. Cathy, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for coming on. Once again, the name of your Substack is Sex and the State. I am a subscriber. I enjoy it, and just delighted to speak with you.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
This week, On the bonus episode, my old pal Alice Vaughn joins me to discuss the economics of pornography. It just feels like, given the subject matter for today and the relative lack of sex in our discussion, that we should have something more lurid, albeit, again, economic and mathematical, on the bonus episode. I met Alice 4 or 5 years ago when she used to host Two Girls, One Mic, which was a podcast that reviewed the plots of pornographic films. And I joined twice and was delightful, and we hit it off and have been friends ever since. And I thought Alice would be fun to talk about the economics of pornography. Plus, she's friends with a bunch of the people that are in those films. So maybe she can weigh in with personal anecdotes and things of her friends and whatnot. So Alice will be joining me to go over some of the numbers in porn, like how much money's in porn exactly? Who watches porn? I haven't done the research yet, but I'm guessing it's kind of a male-heavy audience. I don't know that for sure, but patrons, you'll find out by the time we record it. Stuff that you'd like to know about the driving economic factors that are going on. You can become a patron and listen to that bonus episode by going to thepoliticalorphanage.com. That's thepoliticalorphanage.com. Thanks. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Cathy Reisenwitz, for coming on to discuss sex, marriage, gender, and math. Thank you, patrons who make the show possible. I'm not saying I'd have sex with you. I'm not saying that. I'm not committing to it. But I am more likely to have sex with you than non-patrons. Anyway, until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, America's beloved horny Dick Van Dyke. And so have you.